The scholarship coordinator called me on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I almost ignored it. Unknown number. I assumed it was another loan servicer. I picked up. Her name was Diane. She said, "Congratulations again on the Academic Merit Award. I'm just calling to go over a few things before we finalize the disbursement." I said, "Of course." She said, "I'm looking at your financial profile and I see a $529 education savings account in your name with a current balance of $38,400. Can you confirm that's accurate?" I said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "The 529 account. Registered to you. Former custodians listed." I said, "I don't have a 529 account." She said the account number. Asked if it sounded familiar. I said, "No." She said, "Okay, let me send you the details." She said it carefully. The careful way of someone who has seen this before and knows what it means. I hung up. I sat at my desk with my statistics problem set still open in front of me. $38,400. In an account I had never been told existed. And that wasn't even the worst part, because when I pulled the account history 30 minutes later, the balance hadn't always been $38,000. Someone had already taken money out. While I was taking out loans to pay for the school they had told me we couldn't afford. My name is Lily. I'm 22 years old. I'm in my second year at a state university, a school I got into on my second try, having spent my first year at a community college because I had been told that there was no money for the four-year school. Before I tell you about the account, I need to tell you about my grandmother, because she's the reason any of this exists. Evelyn March was my father's mother. She died 2 years ago at 81. She had been a bookkeeper for 40 years, not an accountant, a bookkeeper, which is a specific thing. She tracked numbers over time. She kept records. She was the person in every room who knew exactly where the money was and what it was doing. She gave me a ceramic coin bank when I was 8 years old, shaped like a barn, red with a white roof, a slot for coins on the side and a rubber plug on the bottom. She set it on the kitchen table and said, "Every dollar you save is a dollar towards something big." I said, "What's the something big?" She said, "You'll know when you get there." I kept the barn on my dresser for 14 years. I added to it irregularly. Birthday money, coins from the bottom of my bag, dollar bills saved from lunch money. When it got full, I emptied it and wrote the amount in a notebook I kept in my desk drawer. When I was 12, she showed me what compound interest was, not a concept, math, on paper with real numbers. She wrote out what happened to $100 over 10 years at different rates, slowly, like it wasn't particularly remarkable. She was teaching me to see money the way she saw it, as something alive, something that grew and tended and shrank when ignored. I was paying attention. I just didn't know she was also doing math with my name attached to it. My grandmother died in August of my senior year. I was 17. I had already started thinking about college, already starting to understand that the finances were tight. My parents had mentioned it more than once, vaguely in the way parents mention things they don't want to explain fully. A few months after she died, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Lily, there's no money for college. You're gonna need loans." I thought about her notebook. I thought about compound interest. I thought about the barn. I said, "Okay." I should have asked him directly if she had left anything for me. He would have had to answer. But I was 17, and I trusted them. I didn't ask. Community college. Then the transfer. Then loans. 20 hours a week at a coffee shop to cover what loans didn't. 2 years of that. And then Diane called. And I found out there had been $38,400 in my name the entire time. I looked at the email she sent. Account holder, Lily Ann March. Custodians, Henry March. Carol March. My parents. Account opened February 2009. I was 3 years old in February 2009. Someone had opened a college savings account for me when I was 3. I pulled up my loan statements in the next tab. $31,400 in federal student loans. 2 tabs open on my screen. One account I'd been told didn't exist. One debt I'd taken on because it did. I sat there for a moment. Then I went looking for the full account history. And the first thing I found made everything worse. I called Madison. Madison is my roommate and closest friend at the school. She grew up in a family that talks about money openly. Her parents are both in finance. And she processes financial information the way other people process weather. As a matter of fact, no drama. I told her everything. The account. The balance. The opening date. Diane's careful tone. She said, "A 529 is a college savings plan. specifically for education expenses. I said, "My parents told me there was no money for college," she said, "and there's a 529 in your name with 38,000 in it." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Lily, what's the current balance versus the peak balance?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Has money come out of it?" I hadn't checked. I pulled up the full history while she waited. The peak balance, $47,200, reached in January of my senior year of high school. The month before, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and told me there was no money for college. The current balance, $38,400. The difference, $8,800, withdrawn after the conversation. While I was enrolling in community college, while I was applying for loans, while I was working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop to cover the rest, I told Madison. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How many withdrawals?" I said, 3. She said, "When?" I scrolled. The first withdrawal, $2,000, April of my senior year, 1 month after my father told me there was no money. The second, $3,500, August of that year, 2 weeks before my first semester of community college started. The third, $3,300, December. While I was completing my first semester on loans and part-time income, I set the statement down. Madison said, "Lily, you need to find out who authorized those withdrawals. You were 18 when you started college. Once you turn 18, the custodianship transfers. Your parents' authority over that account should have ended." I said, "They still had the login credentials." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I was never given them. I didn't know the account existed, so whoever accessed it after I turned 18, it wasn't me." She said, "Then you need to call the financial institution and ask about the authorization on each withdrawal." I did. The answer arrived 30 minutes later. All 3 withdrawals had been authorized using the online account credentials, the username and password for the account, which I had never been given. Because I had never been told the account existed, my parents had maintained access beyond their period of custodial authority, and they had made withdrawals from an account that legally belonged to me. Madison said, "Lily, that's not hiding money. That's unauthorized use of a financial account." That was the moment I understood they hadn't forgotten to tell me. They had made a decision. But then I found something that complicated everything. I called Gerald Holt, my grandmother's estate attorney. I had met him twice, briefly, during the estate process after she died. I said, "Mr. Holt, I have a question about a 529 account that appears to have been funded by my grandmother." He said, "Yes. Evelyn opened that account when you were 3. She contributed to it every birthday and every Christmas for 19 years. He said, "She asked your parents to maintain it as custodians because she wanted it to be a surprise." I said, "A surprise." He said, "She said she wanted you to feel the full impact of it when you needed it. She thought hearing about it in the abstract for years might make it feel less real. She wanted it to arrive at the right time and mean something." I said, "Did my parents know the full balance?" He said, "Yes. The statements went to them as custodians. They knew everything." I sat with that. My grandmother had deliberately kept the account a surprise. She had trusted my parents to reveal it when the time came. They had used that trust as cover. The secret she built with love, they had used to justify their silence. I said, "Did she leave any instructions about the money being used for anything other than my education?" He said, "No. Education only." She was very specific. I said, "Thank you, Mr. Holt." I hung up. And then I remembered something. Freshman year, 2 months into community college, my father had called to check in. Somewhere in the conversation, he'd asked, "Do you really need a new laptop? Can you manage with the old one?" At the time, I thought we were broke. Now I knew he had access to an account with over $40,000 in my name when he said it. I started wondering what else I'd misread. For the first time in my life, I genuinely didn't know if I trusted my parents. And I needed to decide how to proceed before I called them. Because this was no longer just a conversation. It was a confrontation. And I needed to know exactly what I was walking into. I spent 4 days building the full picture before I made contact. Madison helped. She had a systematic mind and no emotional stake, which made her exactly the right person for this. We mapped the timeline on a piece of paper. February 2009, account opened. I was 3. Opening deposit, $3,000, 2009 through 2022, annual deposits aligned with June, my birthday, and December, Christmas. 19 years of contributions. Not large individual amounts, but consistent, precise. The way a bookkeeper puts money aside, without drama, without announcement, just year after year until the number becomes something. August 2022. Contribution stop. My grandmother died. January 2023. My senior year of high school. Peak balance. $47,200. March 2023. My father tells me there's no money for college. April 2023. First withdrawal. $2,000. August 2023. Second withdrawal. $3,500. December 2023. Third withdrawal. $3,300. That was the timeline. 19 years of my grandmother's deposits. Then 3 withdrawals in 11 months. Then me sitting in a dorm room 2 years later, finding out what had been there the whole time. Madison looked at the paper. She said the first withdrawal was 31 days after they told you there was no money. I said, yes. She said, they knew on the day they told you there was no money. I said, yes. She said, are you going to call them? I said, yes. But I need to know how I want to come out of this conversation. She said, what do you mean? I said, do I want to confront them or do I want to understand them? She was quiet for a moment. She said, what's the difference? I said, a confrontation is about what they did. An understanding is about why. She said, can you separate those two things? I thought about it. I said, not completely, but I can decide which one comes first. I decided I needed one more call before I spoke to my parents. I called Gerald Holt a second time. I said, Mr. Holt, I have a follow-up question. He said, of course. I said, when my grandmother set up the account as a surprise, did she tell my parents when to reveal it? She said, when she needs it for school. She was clear. I said, and they never questioned that instruction? He said they never raised any concerns with me. I set the phone down. They had known the instruction. They had known the purpose. They had known the balance. And they had watched me enroll in community college on loans and said nothing. Have you ever found out that someone you loved was telling you one version of your life while living a different version themselves? If you know exactly what that specific thing feels like, type enough in the comments. Because the call with my parents is coming. And what my father said in that call was something I didn't expect. Saturday morning, 4 days after Diane's call. My parents called before I called them, my mother. Her voice is slightly too warm, the warmth of someone who has been rehearsing. She said, sweetheart, we heard from the scholarship office. They mentioned something about a 529 account. My stomach went flat. She said, we wanted to explain before you worried about it. I said, okay. She said, your grandmother opened that account when you were little. We were the custodians. We should have told you sooner. It just slipped through the cracks during a difficult time. I said, Mom? She said, yes. I said, the account statements came to you every year for 19 years. Silence. I said, the account had $47,000 in it in January of my senior year. She said, Lily. I said, you told me there was no money for college 2 months later. Silence. Longer. She said, we were in a very difficult financial position. We intended to replace what we took, we thought. I said, there were 3 withdrawals, Mom. After you told me there was no money, while I was on loans, while I was working. She said, we were going to tell you. I said, the first withdrawal was 31 days after you sat me down at the kitchen table. She stopped. I said, I'd like to talk to you and Dad together. Can we do a call this weekend? She said, yes, Saturday morning. I said, okay. I'm going to ask you something before I tell you what happened Saturday. What do you think my father said when we all got on that call? Option A, he apologized without qualification. Immediately. No explanation first. Option B, he explained the withdrawals as a temporary measure they had planned to reverse. Option C, he said they had decided for my benefit. Knowing about the money would have changed how hard I worked. Drop your answer in the comments, because one of those is what he said. And the one he chose told me something I'm still thinking about. Friday night, the ceramic barn was on my desk. I'd had it since I was 8. Red with a white roof. Rubber plug on the bottom. I'd carried it from my childhood bedroom to my dorm room, The way you carry things that have been in one place for so long. They stop registering until one day you really look at them. I held it. It wasn't heavy anymore. I'd emptied it years ago before leaving for school. But I held it. I thought about Grandma Evelyn at her kitchen table. Stacks of paperwork with a logic she could navigate in 30 seconds. The way she had written out compound interest on paper when I was 12, like it wasn't particularly remarkable. I thought about what Gerald Holt had said. She wanted it to arrive at the right time and mean something. She had spent 19 years making sure it would arrive. Birthday by birthday. Christmas by Christmas. She had died before she could tell me herself. She had trusted my parents to tell me. They hadn't. The tears came without warning. Not a collapse. A quiet overflow I let happen at my desk with the barn in my hands. I cried for Grandma Evelyn, who had done the math quietly and carefully for 19 years and wanted me to feel the full impact. I cried for the version of senior year I didn't get, the one where I might have known, where I might have chosen differently, where I might have walked into my father's conversation and said, I know about the account. That version didn't happen. This one did. I set the barn back on the desk, opened my laptop, transferred the full account, $38,400, to my personal savings. I was the account holder. The money was mine. I completed the transfer at 11:51 Friday night. Then I closed the laptop. If someone built something for you over the years, quietly, without telling you, and you only found out after they were gone, tell me in the comments. Now let me tell you what happened Saturday morning. Saturday, 10:17, video call. My parents' kitchen. The same table where my father had told me there was no money for college. My father looked like a man who had not slept. My mother had the stillness of someone who had practiced something and wasn't sure it was enough. My father said, Lily, we owe you an explanation. I said, yes. He said, the account existed. We knew about it from the beginning. We agreed to manage it until you were ready for college. When the time came, we were in a difficult financial position. There were debts we hadn't been able to discuss with you. We told ourselves that if we told you about the account, you'd expect to use it for school. And if we used any of it to cover what we needed to cover, you'd know. I said, so you didn't tell me. He said, we told ourselves we would replace it. That's why we took the withdrawals, to cover the most immediate things with the plan to put it back before you need it. He said, we didn't put it back. I said, I know. He said, and we watched you take out loans and work through the first 2 years, and we kept telling ourselves there would be the right moment to tell you. I said, there was a right moment. She left instructions for it. He looked at the camera. I said, Grandma told Mr. Holt she wanted it to arrive when I needed it for school. That was the right moment. My father said, I know. I said, instead, it arrived from a scholarship coordinator asking me to confirm a financial account I'd never heard of. He said, I know. I'm sorry. Then I asked the question I'd been sitting with for 4 days. I said, why didn't you tell me? Not the financial reason. The real reason. He was quiet. Then he said, because if you had known, you would have asked questions about where it came from, about why we were struggling, about what we'd used it for, and we weren't ready to have those conversations. I said, so you removed my information to protect yours. A pause. He said, yes, that was more honest than I'd expected. I said, I moved the account Friday night. It's in my name directly. He nodded. He had expected that. I said, here's what I need from you. Not money. Going forward, when there are things that involve me, my finances, my future, decisions that affect my life, I need to be in those conversations. Not protected from them. In them. My mother said, yes. My father said, yes. One word each. I said, okay. I said, I'm not ending this conversation as your enemy. I'm ending it as someone who finally has the full picture. I said, that's different from before. My father said, I know. One word, without addition. He only speaks like that when he really means it. The consequences came quietly, which is its own kind of thing. No attorneys. The $8,800, my parents agreed to repay over 12 months from their own funds, in writing. No court. No filing. Just a document between us that acknowledged the withdrawals and set a repayment schedule. I had thought about the legal route. Madison had laid it out, unauthorized use of a financial account after custodial authority lapses. Clear paper trail. Documented. I had thought about it for 3 days, and I decided that what I needed was not a legal outcome. It was a real one. The scholarship was finalized, $18,000 over 2 years. Combined with the $38,000 in the account, I had more financial clarity than I'd ever had. I spent a week with the university's financial aid office reviewing what could be done about the existing loans. Several could be restructured. The picture was not what it would have been if I'd known at 17, but it was real now. I called Gerald Holt. Not about legal action. To say thank you, and to ask him something I'd been thinking about since the first call. I said, "Mr. Holt, did my grandmother leave any message for me? Apart from the account?" He said, "No formal letter, but she said something when she was finalizing everything. Would you like to hear it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "She said, I've watched that girl her whole life, and she knows how to take care of things. She just needs to know what she has." I held the phone. He said, "I think she knew she might not be there to tell you directly. She was trying to make sure the account reached you regardless." I said, "It did, eventually." He said, "Yes, eventually." I sat with that word, eventually. Not the way she planned, not at the moment she designed it for, but it got there. Madison asked me that evening how I felt. I said, "Like someone who just got a map after 2 years of navigating without one." She said, "Do you know where you're going?" I said, "I know where I am. That's enough for now." She said, "Is it?" I thought about it. I said, "Yes. Knowing where you actually are, that's the starting point. Everything else comes from that." She nodded. She understood. I called my parents the following week. Not about anything specific, just to talk. The call was slightly shorter than usual, slightly more careful. We are in the early days of a version of the relationship where they know that I know the full picture. That changes things, not badly. Honestly. I went home for a weekend in November. No specific occasion. I had a break, and I decided to use it. My parents' kitchen was the same. The table was the same. The particular warmth of a house that has been lived in for a long time. My mother brought coffee. She said, "Your grandmother used to sit at this table when she visited." I said, "I remember." She said, "She always had a notebook with her." I said, "I remember that too." She said, "She asked about you every single time. Not just how you were. What were you doing? What were you thinking about? The specific things." I said, "She taught me compound interest when I was 12. My mother looked at me. I said, "She sat me down with paper and a pen and wrote out what happens to $100 over 10 years. Like it wasn't a big deal." My mother said quietly, "She would have loved to know you got the scholarship." I said, "Yes, she would have." We sat for a moment. My mother said, "We should have told you about the account." I said, "Yes," she said. "There's no version of not telling you that was right." I said, "No, there isn't." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." She said, "Does it help?" I said, "It helps that you said that without explaining why you didn't." She was quiet. She said, "She wanted you to feel the full impact of it." I said, "I felt it." I said, "Not the way she planned, but I felt it." We had dinner. All three of us. Normal things. Before I went to bed, I went upstairs to my old room. The barn was still on my dresser. I stood there for a moment and looked at it. Thought about Grandma Evelyn at her kitchen table with her notebook. The stacks of paperwork with their logic. The math that she did quietly, year after year, birthday by birthday, Christmas by Christmas. Gerald Holt's words. She just needed me to know what I had. She'd done everything she could to make sure I would. It's a morning in December. My dorm room. Early light through the east window. The barn is on my desk. I moved it back when I came home after Thanksgiving. It felt right to have it here. At the school I chose the second time, with the money she built. Coffee is on. The account balance this morning, after the first tuition payment, $31,200. Still growing. The $529 is tax advantaged. The growth compounds faster than a regular savings account. She knew that. Of course she knew that. She was a bookkeeper for 40 years. Here's what I learned from this year. Not about my parents. Not really about the money. About information. Information is not neutral. Withholding it from someone isn't protecting them. It's their decision. It's removing a decision that belongs to them and replacing it with a decision that belongs to you. It's determining without asking what version of their own life they get to live. My parents thought they were protecting me from complexity. From questions they didn't want to answer. What they were actually doing was making decisions that were mine to make. Where to go to school, how much debt to carry, what resources did I have available, what I was walking into. Those decisions were mine. They were made by me with false information in a version of my life that had a false floor. I don't know what I would have chosen differently if I'd known. Maybe nothing. Maybe I would have chosen the community college anyway for my own reasons. Made the same loans. But they would have been my choices. That's the thing that can't be undone. Not the money. The money is there. The choices made in the dark, without the map, those can't be given back. My grandmother understood this. She understood that the full impact of something requires knowing the full picture. That's why she wanted me to feel it when I needed it. Not in the abstract, but at the moment it was real. She didn't account for the possibility that my parents would manage the timing for her. I don't blame her for that. What I have instead of blame is clarity. The clarity of knowing what I have, what was built for me, and what it costs to find out. 19 years of birthday deposits. 19 years of Christmas deposits. My grandmother is at her kitchen table with her notebook, watching something grow. She just needed me to know I had it. I know now. And I'm going to use it exactly the way she built it. One educational expense at a time. The cottage is gone. The barn is on the desk. $31,200. That's enough. That's more than enough. It's everything she planned. Has someone ever built something for you over the years? Quietly, without telling you, that arrived completely differently than they planned. Was it protection or betrayal? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Type barn if the story stayed with you. Subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every day. Check the description for more stories like this one. I'll see you tomorrow.